Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Fields, and I would like to introduce to you today my topic on compulsive internet usage with respect to response inhibition and its impact on academic performance. I would like to introduce to you my thesis committee members, Dr. Milton Faison, Dr. Isis Walton, and Dr. Sherman Ward. Over the past decades, there has been a significant increase in the number of internet users. So why is this important? Why are people addicted to the internet? Or what do we refer to people who are addicted to the internet? We refer to these people as internet addicts, problematic internet users, or compulsive internet usage. Compulsive internet disorder is how it is classified under the DSM-4, is an individual's inability to control their impulsivity to utilize the internet to the point where it affects their daily mental and social behaviors. The DSM-4 derived compulsive internet usage disorder from pathological gambling, and individuals who fall under under eight series of symptoms are labeled as internet addicts. The symptoms are preoccupation with the internet, a need for long periods of time on the internet, repeated attempts to reduce internet use, withdrawal symptoms when using internet use, time management issues, environmental distress from family, work, friends, or school, deception around time spent online, and mood modification through the internet. So why is it that these internet users have such a hard time? Well, one of the primary issues is these individuals struggle with impulse control. Impulse control, an example of impulse control is when someone resists temptation to eat chocolate when they know they shouldn't because they're on a diet. Some people don't have the same ability. Some people, regardless of the situation, they must indulge in chocolate or whatever primary unhealthy foods if they're on a diet. So, what controls response inhibition? Response inhibition focuses on one of our primary executive functions. Our executive functions is a set of general purpose mechanisms that's linked to our prefrontal cortex, the frontal region of the brain, and it regulates human cognition and actions. Executive functions are key components of self-regulation and control, and they affect a broad spectrum of our processes through everyday life. Some of the other executive functions are updating, shifting, and dual tasking, and response inhibition, also under that, which I'll be talking to you about today. Response inhibition is defined as the ability to override the prepotent decision. So when we have this natural impulse, as mentioned before with the chocolate, you have to resist this urge or temptation. That is an example of response inhibition. But those who cannot inhibit the response or have a struggle with inhibitory control, those people are labeled as impulsive. And there are a multitude of ways how people measure impulsivity. Here's an example of Barrett's impulsiveness scale. And the Barrett's impulsiveness scale is a questionnaire that measures impulsiveness and attention, motor control, self-control, cognitive complexity, perseverance, and cognitive instability. And people who are addicted to the internet exhibit the response inhibition. This is the reason why they become addicts. And this isn't just limited to internet addiction. This encompasses all addictions. So impulsivity is action without forethought, and it involves premature response and poor impulse control and low tolerance for delay. Persons who have higher impulsivity are typically pathological gamblers and substance abuse addicts. Example of a pathological gambler is constantly continue to gamble even though they keep indulging in a lot of financial debt. So how do you measure response inhibition? We measure response inhibition one way is through the go, no-go test. The go, no-go test, which consists of two stimuli, a go stimuli, which requires a response to typically a press of a button, and the no-go stimulus that requires the inhibition of the response. To simulate the impulse response, there has to be more go trials than no-go trials, which some may refer to it as the 80-20 rule. How we look at the impulsivity measure, why we look at decreased response inhibition is through, or measure impulsivity through this test, is looking at the amount of errors during the no-go trials and the faster response time to the no-go trials. This is the framework of the actual no-go test. As you can see, there's in our particular test, we had a green box that indicated the go stimulus. And whenever the participant was told to see a red box, they were supposed to inhibit the response. If they was presented with the red box and they inhibited the response, they didn't press the button, this was successful impulse control. Another test that we use in order to look at the actual neurocircuitry of everything is the EEG, which is a great way of understanding, as you mentioned, executive function. You get to see the actual neuroactivity and the sensory functions along with cognitive processes that's being generated throughout the brain. We use this test in order to monitor neurosubstrates. And the primary area that we'll be focused on, with which I would call it event-related potentials, or ERPs, is the N200 and P3 complex, which are components that are located in our regions near executive function. Response inhibition. The neurosubstrates involved in impulsivity and important for top-down control. As we know, we use the front part of our brain and it processes all the way through and back up again, are the nucleus accumbens, the ventral stratum, and also the frontal regions, as we mentioned, the prefrontal cortex. One other is the orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which are actually implicated in the go, no-go test. Now I'll get into a little bit of the neurocircuitry of addiction. When addicts experience a decrease in response inhibition, there's an actual circuitry that's going on that causes the dysregulation for them to actually process information or for them to control their needs. So as you see here, the insula and the hippocampus, when they have the sensory information, when they detect the conflict or the stimulus is triggered, those when the cravings or the anticipation is generating. So people tend to get real eager. And it all leads back to the prefrontal cortex, which also again is linked to executive function, and it ties into the reinforcement of either to draw into the impulse or actually withhold from the impulse. And those who tend to wean away from this dysregulation, that's the reason why we go through withdrawal symptoms, because the brain is actually trying to correct itself or to fix the neurocircuitry. Here is the anatomy of the brain that you can actually see the prefrontal cortex. The anterior cingulate plays a key role in response inhibition by orchestrating the signals to be sent to the prefrontal cortex to activate our conflict monitoring system that we see in our ERP in the N200. And its job is to recognize the presence of the stimuli, and the P300 is how we process and we respond accordingly. So when there's dysregulations in the system, this is the lead on to poor response inhibition. The N200, when we look into the EEGs, we see a negative deflection peak at about 200 milliseconds to 400 milliseconds. 200 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds. And due to the sensitivity of both, they're typically studied together. The N200 studied for looking at stimulus identification, attentional shifts, inhibition of motor functions, conflict monitoring and response, select timing, and novel stimuli. So if we see something new, this is the reason to recognize it, and it's supposed to send the proper signal to the P3 in order to initiate the appropriate response. The P300 has been widely studied for a while. For most adults between the ages of 20 to 70 possess a latency of about 250 milliseconds to 400 milliseconds after the onset stimuli. Post-onset stimulus, and this is the time that it takes for these signals to travel through the brain. But this varies depending on depth and, of course, working memory. Typically in the P300, we also highlight as an indicator the shortened latency times indicate mental superiority and mental performance. And the P300 is also broken down into two categories. The P3A, which is responsible for attentional orientation, and P3B, which is responsible for index working memory. And reductions in the P3 amplitudes is you'll see in a wide variety of neurological and psychosocial vulnerabilities, substance abuse, alcoholism, and risky behavior practices, along with adult antisocial behaviors. So over the years, there's been an increased rise and the need to study addiction, and there's a particular cause for that. It's affecting our youth. As we see now, a lot of internet users have increased drastically, and the primary users are between the ages of 14 to 21. These people are constantly on the internet, and they're losing that social interaction that we once had from playing outside, and these individuals are becoming social isolated, and they're not developing the proper social skills. In doing so, this actually leads on to poor It's said to lead on, without having these particular skills, it leads on to poor academic performance. We have a constant standard measure of academic performance, and the measure is the GPA. The definition of academic performance is the outcome of education by which the students, teachers, or institution has achieved their educational goals. And looking at academic performance, impulsivity and inattention are key components of self-regulation and the early part of child development. We know children are always active, and it's hard to keep them still. But learning how to regulate these components is key to success, academic success. And students who tend to struggle with this as they grow older, with the reduction in attention span, are more likely to translate into hyperactive and lead on to poor academic performance as they get older. So my research aims was here we wanted to investigate whether problematic internet use would affect response inhibition and would it correlate with poor academic performance. Our first hypothesis was students with high compulsive internet use will exhibit poor response inhibition and will correlate with poor academic performance. Our second hypothesis was students with decreased response inhibition will correlate with poor academic performance. And the third, students with high compulsive internet usage will exhibit lower N2 amplitudes and higher PT amplitudes. Our methodology was we took 83 students who were recruited through the introductory biology classes here at Virginia State University. The average student, the range of our students' age was between 17 and 36, with a mean average of 21. And data was collected through the Qualtrics online survey, and academic performance was all self-reported. And we utilized the Merkirk compulsive internet use scale. The results. We first wanted to look at the relationship between high college GPA and compulsive internet usage, and we found that high and low GPA students did not differ on the compulsive internet usage. For all variables we used here, we all measured them inversely to look if there was another significant correlation between the relationships. Here we looked at students who scored high on the compulsive internet usage score, who scored on the compulsive internet usage scores by gender as well. And we saw that there was no correlation observed between the high or low or by gender for compulsive internet users with respect to academic performance. We wanted to then look at the amount of errors of commission, which are the no-go errors. And what we found here was CIU did not correlate with poor impulse control. Then we wanted to investigate, look at the people who did have a significant high number of errors of commission. And we found here was males with high errors of commission or high no-go errors exhibited compulsive internet usage. Then we actually wanted to look at the errors of omission. The percent no-go errors actually look at inattentiveness, attentional capacity. Are people really paying attention when they're looking at this? And what we saw here was amongst the groups and by genders, there were no observed relationships between inattentiveness. But inversely, we found that, again, the males actually with logo errors were more compulsive internet users in comparison to females with no-go errors, with low no-go errors. Another way to look at impulsivity is, again, was reaction time. So we also looked at that as well amongst the CIUS scale, and we saw there was no observed differences in reaction time for the GO trials amongst the groups. But when you looked at it from the individuals who had faster reaction times for the GO trials, we saw that the males had faster reaction times in the GO trials, also exhibiting compulsive internet users, compared to females with faster reaction times, GO reaction times. For the reaction times for the no-goes, which also was a significant indicator for impulsivity, there were no correlations with compulsive internet users amongst the groups compared to the reaction times. But again, the compulsive internet users when compared to females with faster reaction times. So we understood that we understand the relationship that poor response inhibition leads on to internet addiction, but we wanted to see how response inhibition tied into academic performance. And what we saw here was there was no relationship between GPA and decreased response inhibition. But inversely, we also saw that females with greater impulse control had higher GPAs compared to females with decreased response inhibition. And also with the percent goals, we saw that females with higher GPAs showed greater attentiveness than females with the lower GPAs. And there was no relationship observed amongst groups for attentiveness by GPA. So when we looked at the EEGs, first of all, we focused on front to back. So we looked at the frontal, central, and parietal regions of the brain. And what we saw here was there was no correlation observed for response inhibition peaks in the frontal cortex between the high and low CI compulsive internet users. We could not separate these by gender due to our sample size. In the central region, midline, there were no differences observed in amplitude peaks against the two groups as well. But going back to our hypotheses, we said that the higher compulsive internet users will exhibit lower in two amplitudes, but they do not. But we do see a clear indication that there are increased number. There is a higher P3 amplitude. And again, there were no observed differences in the parietal regions between groups as well. This would suggest compulsive internet users did not have lower N2 peaks, but had greater P3 amplitudes, suggesting compulsive internet users have a difficult time processing the appropriate response, but our data was not significant. This should be taken as evidence for future evaluation. On to discussion. So based on our data, it shows that males with high error percent for the no-go trials and faster reaction times had a decrease in response inhibition, which correlates with high compulsive internet usage. And females with decreased impulse control show poor academic performance. And finally, females with good academic performance have better impulse control and greater attentional capacity. And that will conclude my presentation.